All right, everyone, welcome back to the YouTube channel of hockeyprospect.com and welcome to episode 7 of Scouting Sessions. I'm Jérôme Bérubé, and as always, I'm joined by Brad Allen. Brad, how's it going?
Good, Jérôme. How are you doing?
Good. I'm a bit, I'm away this week visiting family back home in the eastern part of the province of Quebec. So didn't watch as much game as usually I do. So that's why you and I this week we're gonna talk about something different that we have not done so far. Usually we gonna talk about the NHL draft, but now we're gonna go back in time talking about some players that we have missed back in 2018. So this is going to be players we got wrong, 2018 NHL Draft edition. So that draft class, we could do maybe 3 or 4 podcasts on players we got wrong. Uh, this is this was a very strange draft. Back then, it was a strange draft, and looking back 6 years later now, I think Brad, you agree this is one of our toughest draft, I think, as scout. And looking at the results 6 years later, that's we all often say this was a bit of a nightmare draft to evaluate. I think 6 years later, we're it's pretty accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not even going to talk about Quinn Hughes today, but that's another. We could definitely talk about Quinn Hughes. I mean, we had him top 10, but he should have been top 2. So, it's just one of those situations where we missed out on some uber max superstar type of players, but we also missed in areas that we usually hit in. But to your point, that's a bad draft. So a lot of people are going to look too good, including us, which makes me feel slightly better, but not totally. I remember I did like a little history lesson of the last decade of goaltending scouting. That draft had the most goalies drafted at 28 and the least hits. Eric Portillo will make it 3. Well, yeah, 3 hits if Portillo plays for the Kings and is good. So 3 out of 28, which is as bad as it gets. And that goes right through the whole draft. The whole draft was just all over the map, from Filip Zadina to Adam Boquist. And I think the big thing with that draft is it was the litmus test with these smaller defensemen and how they're going to operate at the NHL level. And the big mistake we made with Quinn Hughes was that at that time he couldn't defend. And you can make an argument he's still not a great defenseman, but it doesn't matter because he always drives possession and he's always worth it offensively over his defensive lapses. So it just, what we thought would counterbalance the ranking didn't, because he's just so good. It doesn't matter if he's mediocre at all defensively ever. It just doesn't matter. He's that good offensively. So we didn't take that into account and weight that correctly. And that was at that time where we had Kel McCarr correct. So we got Kel McCarr. And the reason why is because McCarr was growing. We thought he had potential to be a better defenseman long term. But to be honest with you, that also doesn't really matter. It's either you get the uber defenseman who's just incredible and can hit 90, 100 points a season, and then the defense, you just insulate him, and that's that. These two-way guys, it's different. So, yeah, the way we evaluated then, I think, is very different than the way we try to evaluate some of these kids now.
Yeah, this was the draft that saw the most defensemen under 6 foot getting drafted in the first round. I think there was 8 or 9 going in the top 32. It's never gonna happen again. I mean, it's always a trend, but I'd be very surprised that we see a year where we have 8 or 9 defensemen under 6 feet getting drafted. Hey, last year's draft, there was 3 total defensemen under 6 feet getting drafted.
And that makes sense, Jerome, because the teams that drafted those defensemen in 2018, they now know. Yeah. This was the year where if they're not hitting now, if Ty Smith isn't coming in now, he's not coming in, right? So just one example, many. Adam Boquist is on his third team. So it's one of those situations where, I think we needed this data now. Every team needed this data, and now look at the results as everybody's starting to track back. However, it's still a tricky game because, as you know, you're in Montreal. Another player we definitely had to is dominating right now, and that's Hudson. So occasionally that type of player is still there, and now they're dropping way past where they should as a result of the misses that other teams have had in a draft like the 2018 class. So it's a tricky it's a very difficult task. But teams that can do it successfully, they're going to be just so much further ahead than some of these other teams that have difficulty finding these small defensemen that actually hit correctly.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it with Quinn Hughes. Like, he's a defenseman who drive possession. I mean, it's the same thing with Lane Hudson. Like, he always has the puck on his stick. So when he's on the ice, his team has the puck not most of the time, but more than 50% of the time. So even if he's very, average defensively, it doesn't matter. Like, because he has the puck. I mean, it does matter, but not as much if he didn't drive possession like he does already at the NHL level. So those are maybe, if you're scouting smaller defensemen, that's maybe like one thing you really have to pay close attention to, who is driving the play. We're going to talk about one of those defensemen in this episode today. Not dynamic, not skill-wise, not dynamic, skating-wise, small defensemen under 6 feet that are not, very athletic. Those guys don't play as much anymore. So scouting is tough. It's really hard to evaluate, players at 17 years old, 18 years old. Also, NHL teams, like the trends are changing. Not every year, obviously, but you really have to follow the NHL to know, what's going to work at the NHL level and what doesn't work. And back in 2018, the small defenseman was, drafting those guys was not an issue back then, because they saw, Cale Makar, 2017, going fourth overall. And even the years before that, there's a lot of smaller defensemen going high in the draft. And I feel like 2018, after, back starting in 2020, this is where everything changed. Teams like notice, like, those big defensemen come playoff time, they really matter. So it's getting harder and harder for, those smaller defensemen to make it. So they have to have real special, attributes to yes, they can maybe like get away with it at in the NHL during the regular season, but come playoff time, those guys are in a bit of a trouble come playoff time. So it's really interesting. So maybe we can start with maybe the first guy that you want to talk about, and it's Vitali Kravtsov, 9th overall pick of the New York Rangers. We had him, I believe, 6th. He was ranked 6th by us back in 2018. Very talented hockey player, but it just didn't work out for him as we see here. He's back in Russia the last 2 years. Maybe your thoughts on what happened with him during maybe his draft year and what happened after that with his NHL career.
Yeah, so he is like one of the perfect examples of what happens when you have a kid who is breaking historical records. So he produced the most at the Gagarin Cup, the KHL playoffs, and his age category at that time out of any draft eligible forward. He had an accelerated development curve. He was playing in the VHL, which is equivalent of the AHL over in Russia. And he had a frame that was broad, wide. He was tall. So naturally you think, okay, there's a growth rate opportunity there in terms of putting on some mass and then being able to compensate for, at the time, the perceived weakness, which was the skating. Skating wasn't great. It wasn't bad, but that was the one area where it's like, okay, if the kid can put on a lot of mass and more muscle, he can get a much better open ice power. And just his peak power output from a skating perspective would go up significantly, and then he would be fantastic. That was kind of like the thought process. He is the case study for showing what happens when a prospect has a perfect season and that it can mask the major deficiency in his game. And what I mean by that is, I just said he broke records. He never had a situation where he was really tested. It wasn't one of those things where he was demoted and then worked through that, grinded his way back to the top. And then we got to see that he just stayed in the KHL. He was insulated there, and he took off at the right time at the end of the season and looked fantastic in the playoffs at his age, in his age category. So it was one of those situations where hyper skilled, didn't show any sort of major weakness, looked like he had tremendous amount of potential to develop into a finesse-oriented dual threat winger that could put up 60, 70, 80 points, depending on the season. And what was masked was the psychological makeup of the kid. The kid's mental game is non-existent. He was the second he was demoted to the AHL by the New York Rangers, he threw a fit. He didn't want to play. He wanted to go back home immediately. It's one of those situations too where I know financially he was well off, which is obviously a little less common in Russia. So it's not like it's one of those situations where it's make or break for him. And some of these kids, like, you bring them outside their comfort zone, especially for Russians. It's a very different type of society. So they come over to North America, and the acclimation will be extremely jarring, right? It's a jarring process for them. But some of these kids grind through it. I remember Dmitry Voronkov last season. He wanted to go back home. He was playing great, but it was really just the environment. He was uncomfortable in it. And instead of leaving, he bit down on his mouth guard, and now look at him. He was doing fantastic before his injury here at the start of the season. So, and he's Igor Chinikov of Columbus is another example. Kirill Marchenko played in the AHL. Didn't have any issue. You never heard a word from him apparently off ice. He was all in. Vitali Kravtsov was the exact opposite of those three Russians mentioned. There's millions more I can mention. So, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, Jérôme, during a podcast with Alexei Kolosov, how he was not going to come over the AHL unless it was NHL starts. That's terrifying. That's the exact same mentality that made sure Vitali Kravtsov busted. So it can be extremely difficult to predict the maturity of a player long-term. And it can absolutely burn you. It's burned us. And this is an example of that, because he had all the talent in the world, and he just bolted. He left when things became tough and he wasn't getting his way. He just left. And that's the Russian factor, right? And that's why some teams are extremely wary of drafting Russians high, because most of them won't come and play unless it's the NHL. And they always have that get out of jail card where they can just go right back to Russia if they're not feeling comfortable, and make considerable money if they're playing the KHL. So that's really what happened. I have Vitali Kravtsov top 3. Okay. 6. Come on now. That's child's play. I'm 3. So I thought this kid was going to be a superstar, not just like a good player. Or, he's a first line winger. I thought this kid was going to be like a straight up superstar, like not Kucherov levels, but we'd be talking about him every year as like a perennial top 20 pick in like a fantasy draft, as an example. Like, I really thought he would be huge. I really did. And he is burned. He reminds me, I'm reminded a lot of where I went wrong with this kid, because he was, for me, I can't think of a player that I was all in on more, that's made me have to reevaluate and get comfortable with the idea of, okay, the kid had a perfect draft, therefore what do we do? Well, we got to take that as a variable that actually be a negative instead of a positive. I never thought of it before Vitali Kravtsov happened.
All right, my turn now. The 6th overall pick in this 2018 draft was Filip Zadina, and he was the guy that we all got wrong, obviously. But to me, it's just a really good lesson to not sometimes believe the hype of some players are getting, because I believe he was 4th on the list in that draft class. I was not a huge Zadina guy. He didn't blow me away at any point in his draft year. I thought there was some character missing from him. Like, I remember the first game I saw, he got first game live that I saw. There's a ton of NHL scout I remember in that game, and in the first period he gets hit. Looks like a knee hit. He looks like he's dead. Looks like he's gonna be injured for the next 7 months, and then he goes back to the locker room, and then 5 minutes later he comes back and he's fine. And this was a bit of a running theme for him all year long. For me, I saw him, getting hurt. Looks like it's really bad, and then he's fine. So there's a lot of lack of compete from him, but he was a talent. But I was never blown away by him. But that's another lesson you'll learn sometime as a young scout, is to trust yourself, which is sometimes the hardest thing to do as a scout, is really to trust yourself. For example, he was fourth. We had Noah Dobson, number 5. Noah Dobson was my guy. I thought Noah Dobson was going to be, a really great first pairing defenseman in the NHL, and he has become that. He has become a different version of what we projected. We projected more, defense first, then offense will, he'd be a 45, 50 point, around those stats at the NHL level. But the defense was supposed to be really good, and it's funny how sometimes it goes. His offense is better than what we project, but his defense is way, way worse than what we saw. But anyway, the point was, Dobson was my guy, and I still rank Zadina above him for what? Maybe I saw everyone thought he was a top 3 pick in this draft, and maybe at that time I didn't really have the guts to keep dropping Zadina on my list. You really, really have to trust yourself as a scout. You might be wrong, but it's better to be wrong with your opinion than being right with someone else's opinion. That's a bit of my Zadina draft year story. I was never blown away by him. I knew the talent was there, but there's always something missing for me. And come our final rankings meetings, and I'm kind of chicken out. Kept him, at 4th, even though I love, Dobson way better than him. So, and what went wrong with him at the NHL level? Again, the lack of compete, the lack of being assertive on the ice. So all of that play a role with him not working out at the NHL level. And now he's back in Czech Republic playing. He's in Switzerland this season. But anyway, things didn't work out for him at the NHL level. It was never a skill question mark with him. It was always about, does he really want this? And clearly didn't want this, bad enough at the NHL level. And it is what it is. But this is a bad ranking, but it's a bad ranking for everyone, because he was ranked as a top 5 player, everywhere. People thought the Red got a major steal with him at 6 back in 2018. Didn't really work out for them. So, Brad, the next guy on your list, from Germany, Dominik Bokk, who he was a guy that you really like in his draft year. Didn't really work out for him. So maybe tell us about Dominik Bokk out of Germany. He's been back in Germany for 4 straight years now. So tell us what happened here.
Well, very similar psychologically to Vitali Kravtsov. Look where they play. They're playing back home. They're playing in their comfort zone. They never won it. So Dominik Bokk, I am convinced St. Louis. I was never told this behind the scenes or anything, but I'm convinced St. Louis changed part of the draft strategy because of Dominik Bokk. That's how bad Dominik Bokk's development went. So it's one of those things where how low can you really put a hyper skill player? And that was the Dominik Bokk question, because Dominik Bokk was one of the most talented players in the 2018 class, remarkable hands, everything that you would need to qualify as a dual threat. At times would make magical plays happen where oh my God, the upside is crazy. Imagine if this happens and that happens. And you start running around in your head thinking about the potential for him 6 years down the line when he makes it. And there was one critical difference between him and Vitali Kravtsov. Well, even you can argue two. So the first is that Vitali Kravtsov was accelerated and at least broke historical records at the Gagarin Cup, or aka the KHL, which is an elite league. So that's more forgivable. Dominik Bokk only put up like a point per game in J20. And that's where things get tricky. So you have this hyper talent who shouldn't even be in J20, and he's only point per game in J20, which is the Swedish Junior League, just if any of our listeners don't know what that is. So really you're looking at, with Sweden's top players, you're almost always looking at first-year eligibles that basically mince the J20 in their -1 seasons, and then they're playing either in the Allsvenskan or SHL in their draft seasons. Very rarely do you get like a case like Victor Arvidsson, for instance, who was like point per game in J20, and now look at him. So, that was one of the big telling signs. It's like, okay, the kid should have 60, 70 points at J20 level. Instead, he's only point per game is like 40 something points. So the other is that Dominik Bokk would at least flash the potential to want to have an off-puck game and have some attention to detail away from the puck when it mattered. So, for instance, he had pretty good back-checking effort level, and he knew how to strip pucks off players. That was one thing that I always looked at. And I was like, okay, well, if you can generalize that long-term, if he's willing to back-check, you probably get him to play defense when it matters too. Because that time, he didn't even know what defense was. He had no understanding of positioning, even base raw positioning. I remember he's called up a couple times, Rome in the SHL. I've never seen a kid look more lost along the boards, for instance. He had no secondary skill set whatsoever when it came to trying to obtain or get a puck back, or fighting through checks along the wall, or knowing how to like cross, like a little cross, or time a little cross check to try to disrupt a player who's about to pick up the puck, and so he can come in and try to grab it back. There was nothing like that in this game. So incredibly raw. He was incredibly raw. His numbers never spoke to being a star player in any capacity, but man, did he ever flash some magic. And I ever get captivated by that magic. It's just one of those things where it happened. So yeah, we've talked about this before. Oscar Olausen, Nick Suzuki, they fall into this category with Vitali Kravtsov and Dominik Bokk, where all the talent in the world, if there's nothing upstairs to harness it, if you don't have that want, if you don't have the compete, this is why, like, when I'm on my radio show discussing this with executives and other people, they always mention the want factor, because they've seen so many players in their age group when they were NHLers bomb out because they didn't have it. And that's why they always bring it up. And it's really an art form as a scout to be able to pick those players and know that they have it. And then even more importantly, pick out the ones that look like stars, but they don't. And that's where the tricky part comes in. That's where we get Filip Zadina. You get a little, I didn't like Filip Zadina either, but everybody had him super high. And when he was on, he was really on. So you want to give him benefit of the doubt. But that's where you got to go with the gut. As Jérôme said, you got to go with the gut and say, okay, like he's this high everywhere, but to us, like, he's never given us that feeling, that gut feeling that makes sense for that slot. So Dominik Bokk's another example of that.
Yeah, I mean, so far, like the three player that we have picked, and the fourth one will be the same thing here. All guys that had tons of talent, but like between the ears, like right ear, it was not the best. So, and the NHL is always going to be it's the #1 league on the planet. It's really hard to make it and to be really successful. So if you're not almost obsessed with your craft, and you're not ready to compete on every shift, every game, it's not gonna happen for you. So moving on to my player, it's Oliver Wahlstrom, of the still within New York Islanders. He was with the US program back then. Again, that's another story of trusting yourself, because that year there was two players on the US national team that we had ranked in a similar range. It was Oliver Wahlstrom and Joel Farabee. And all year we had Farabee ahead of Wahlstrom, but we knew Farabee had less natural talent than Wahlstrom, but he had the more complete game. He was more of a true NHLer. So, and we were right. But then what happened? What happened at the end of the year? We saw Wahlstrom score, quite a few goals at the U18. We got scared that, hey, if we miss on this guy, we're gonna look bad here. So we made the switch. Again, not really trusting ourselves. And to be honest, as far as like hockeyprospect.com, this was a bit of this was the last year. I think we just said enough with this. Let's just trust ourselves. We're good scouts. We know what we're doing. And I really feel like 2018, and also we also changed the way we rank guy with like grades and ratings. So this was the last year of like doing the old way. Now we really focus more on like our own philosophy of scouting. So I think after 2018, we really changed how we scout, how we rank guys, how we evaluate them. So this was again, we really had nightmares about 2018 draft. So yeah, Wahlstrom, and it's funny, like Islanders getting him at 11. So the Islanders have tried this 3 times. They like the one trick pony sniper that can potential give you 40 goals. They have tried this 3 times in the past decade. They tried with Kiefer Bellows. They tried with Oliver Wahlstrom, and now Cole Eiserman. The first two complete fail. It's not gonna happen for either of them. The jury is still out on Cole Eiserman, but it's very interesting how the Islanders they really want that type of player, and it has not worked out for them. We're not really high on Cole Eiserman. If you saw our draft preview last year, me and Brad just not too crazy about Cole Eiserman, but let's see how he does in college this year, and we'll reevaluate him and see how things goes. But it's when they took Heisman in last year's draft, I just started laughing. I'm like, yeah, another Kiefer Bellows, another Oliver Wahlstrom situation with the Islanders. So yeah, so Wahlstrom, same thing as Zadina, like super talented player, just didn't maybe have the mental game to really perform at the NHL level. Obviously, we all knew he had really good hands, really good shot. We knew he could score goals, but I get nervous. I get nervous now because I feel like more and more those I guess one trick pony shooter like Wahlstrom, less and less they're having success at the NHL level. You need like a B game. If you can't score, what can you do for me? And some guys will adjust. I think maybe a guy like Cole Caulfield has adjust at the NHL level. Even as a really small player, I think his two-way game has improved. His playmaking has improved too from where it was in college. Wahlstrom didn't, and like other one-dimensional sniper, a lot of them have not. So I always get a bit nervous in every draft when we have a one-dimensional shooter that all he does is I'm good at scoring goals, but the rest of my game, it's pretty average. I mean, that's one reason why we're not too crazy about Cole Eiserman last season. He was just a one-trick pony. So that's what happened with Wahlstrom at the NHL level. Couldn't find a B game. Couldn't get his other part of his game to a good standard at the NHL level, and it's not looking good for him going forward. Going forward with the Islanders and the NHL. So again, lesson learned. Trust yourself. We had Farabee ahead of him all year. Change it on the last rankings, and now we suffer for it. Brad, your next guy you want to talk about? Jakub Skarek, again, New York Islanders draft pick, third round. So he was not a high pick, obviously, but as a goalie, I know you were really high on him. Every time you talk about missing out on a goalie, it's always his name that comes back in the conversation. So tell maybe your viewers about Jakub Skarek, who is still in the Islanders farm system this season.
Well, I'll start by saying, look at all the players we've talked about so far, too. What are they all lacking? Pace of play, off the puck support, skill sets, attention to detail. It's funny because some people, I think, when it comes to scouting, they think the on the puck is the most important. And in reality, like it really is a balancing act. You really have to care about the other 95% of the time, because when they don't have the puck, it still really matters. That's so, you know, you can get bewildered as a scout with talent level when they're the flashes and dashes, and then you can kind of forget what's happening when it's more low key and more subtle and off the puck. In the case of Jakub Skarek, so this is the only player on this list that still has a chance to actually make it. Out of any of them, like this is the one kid. So this kid has the natural talent. He's still in the A. He's still developing. Unlike every other player we've talked about today, this kid's mental profile is extremely good. He apparently works incredibly hard. He's very mature. He's been a pro for over 6 years, almost, I think, 7 years now. Like, he was an accelerated goalie, which is very interesting. The other accelerated goalies that have made, Ilya Sorokin was accelerated, playing the KHL in his initial rookie season. Yaroslav Askarov is an accelerated example as well. Emil Vinny, this past draft, is accelerated. He was playing U20 Sarju in Finland when he was 15, which is like unheard of. And then Skarek is an accelerated case. And I bring up the accelerated case study because at that time, I found it almost impossible for a kid who looked as good as he did in Czechia too, which was equivalent of the AHL for Czechia, at 16 to be that good. Like, he put up like a 942 save percentage. He looked absolutely otherworldly to me, and his consistency rates were sky high. What made him incredibly tricky to evaluate was that his peak performances certainly looked like NHL caliber and still do to this day. But then his bad, even medium level, or I shouldn't say effort level, medium level performances and lower level performances, or just straight up bad performances, are like way astronomically worse than you would expect, even in like trying to like gauge a backup. So the spectrum of outcomes on a game-to-game basis were all over the map, and even back then, especially internationally. And that was where things get super tricky with him. He was so bad internationally, which speaks to a lack of being able to adapt into with defensive structure that's new. So that's kind of a telling sign for a goalie who's having some difficulty with tracking and assessment, some anticipation issues, and not knowing where his defense is supposed to be, depending on the context of each play. But then you look at him in Czechia, and his best performances in the top Czech league against some of the best teams were fantastic. So it was like, what is going on? Like, how can he be this bad at the U20s, but then be this good in Czechia? So from my perspective, I basically had to go all in and say, okay, the real version's the one in Czechia, or go all out and say the real one's the one in U20s. I don't think there's an in-between scenario here. And for the last couple of years, it seems like the one that reared its ugly head at the U20 level was the real version, because he would have way too many inconsistent performances the last several years. Now, I will say I've been watching him more because, you know, it's like, it's one of those, you know, it's Halloween, you know, Mike Myers, Freddy Krueger, they're always coming for you. It doesn't matter if you're dreaming. It doesn't matter if you're sprinting away. Mike Myers is always around the corner. Jakub Skarek's always around the corner of my thoughts, because he really is somebody that just destroyed my evaluation. So I always try to go back and figure out what's going on. One thing I'll say is that I misevaluated at his age, when in his actual draft season, was his skating base. I thought his skating was further along than it was. However, I did see improvements in the preseason, and he has actually gotten off to a good start here. It's not that this kid doesn't have the tool. He's not even a kid anymore, but it's not that this young man doesn't have the skill set to actually still play. It's just he needs to be able to get the consistency rates to go at least to a completely different level so he can be a backup in the NHL. Let's forget about starter potential. That's, I think, done. But if you looked at maybe even, could he get to a split starter? maybe, but like a backup, I really think is still viable for him at this stage in his development. Just with the consistency rates, it's all about the consistency rates. It always is. Connor Hellebuyck just had his 500th game, in 500th game, and it's one of those situations where why is Connor Hellebuyck so good? It comes down to his mental fortitude. It's his mental rate of consistency. He basically never plays bad games of hockey. It's not that he's just this otherworldly skill set and he's this freak athlete, and he's not that. It's the mental game. And that's what Skarek has lacked. And that's what but Skarek still has time to make up for that a bit. And that's the whole issue with goaltending, the maturity aspect. Like goalies at 24, as you know, Jérôme, they're not done. So it'll be very interesting to monitor, but no matter what, I definitely had him in the wrong spot. So he's a miss still for me.
Yeah, this isn't good competition with the Islanders in their goalie prospect pool. Obviously, they draft Marcus Gidlov last season, but they also have the big Finn.
Looks like a steal, by the way. Looks like a steal right now. Gidlov is looking very good.
Yeah, I mean, we were pretty surprised he went that late in the draft. Also, they have the big Finn playing with Skarek in the AHL, I believe, Tikkanen. Yeah. So he's a very interesting prospect too. So we'll see. But like you said, like he's 24 years old. So it's not over for a goalie at 24. we have seen guys start playing in the NHL at 26, 27 years old as a goalie. So
just look at Alex Lyon. Look at Alex Lyon.
Yeah,
Alex Lyon was not like I thought Alex Lyon would be out of the league 3 years ago. Now look at him. It's unreal what how long it can take for kids to. Again, he's not a kid anymore. I remember watching when he was a kid. It takes a long time for some of these goalies. It really does for them to calibrate and figure out exactly what works for them. It takes a long, long time. His friend there, the Washington goalie, Charlie Lindgren, another perfect example. Charlie Lindgren, night and day when he became a Cap. So again, it can take Jakub Markstrom, Jérôme. How about that as an example? In Florida, it looked like he was done. He's another one. I had him sky high. I loved Jakub Markstrom. Was one of the best goalie prospects ever. He didn't even look like he was going to play when he was in Florida. It takes time. It takes a long time for some of these kids.
What about Samuel Montembeault? Speaking of Florida,
You're right. That's a great example, Jérôme. And ironically, Florida, and then he switches up. And that's not to say that Florida's development is not good in net. They absolutely developed. Like Anthony Stoller's had his best seasons there. Bobrovsky's obviously won a cup there now, and Spencer Knight. Mentally, obviously he's making some adjustments, but I think he'll be fine. So it's not just we're not trying to bash Florida's goaltending development at all. It's just one of those things where I think it's probably more correlative. It's not.
Yeah, sometimes it's just situation. Like it's not the right situation for a goalie. He changed teams, but mostly changed goalie coach, and something new will click with that goalie and that goalie coach, and then. Montembeault's looking pretty good in Montreal. Didn't look when he came to Montreal, he looked like not good at all. He looked very confused in that. Very, very different composure now. A lot more confident.
He couldn't even read the game in Florida. I didn't think he was even going to play. When he was in Florida, I was like, there's no chance he's playing full-time in the NHL. And I remember watching him when he first got to Montreal. I watched him against Merzlikins in Columbus, and he was fantastic. And I was like, wait, what? So I watched like an 8-9 game sample. I couldn't even – it's not even the same goalie. It's not even the same goalie. Like his reads, everything, his anticipation, his confidence, his swagger, it's just not the same goalie whatsoever. It really is. It's like I always use this as the comparison. I know it's a player instead of a goalie, but like look at Elias Pettersson right now. I know Vancouver. Look at him. It's not Elias Pettersson. He's a shell of himself. And then sometimes that's why it's so hard to predict some of these players because is the shell version the real version or is it not? And then that's the tricky part of scouting in their initial draft season. You got to you can't meet them halfway. I mean you can. Listen, online public. One of the reasons we're doing this just for everybody to hear is like publicly. People either love to rationalize their work or straight up flat out hide from their work. There's examples online. I won't name names, but there's examples out there and they know who they are where they'll get something completely wrong. and then they'll put out a video to mask it immediately, just stating how the kid's development's taken off or stating how much better he looks. And that's to mask the fact that they didn't do a very good job scouting the player in the first place. I've seen versus comparisons of players where they're like, well, we had one ahead of the other, but because the development system, that player we like less, like better is worse. The development system's worse. That just means that we didn't actually miss. They're just in the wrong system now. And it's like, you got to be very careful how you play that game. You really do. Like you good scouting means that you're okay with knowing when you're wrong and knowing when you got to improve. And that's the hope with this type of format for everybody is like, we missed. We absolutely emphatically missed on some of these players.
I mean, you have to learn from your mistake. So that's what we do pretty much every year. We go back, check what we had, 5 years before, like we're doing today, 2018 draft. We're looking at guys that we missed. And, over the last few years, me and Brad and our staff, we have gone and like, okay, what did we miss on this player? Why is he not becoming what we thought he was going to become? And as a scout, that's what you need to do. You can just say, well, you got drafted by the wrong team and they don't develop well, and that's why. That's a very easy cop out, in my opinion. So anyway, to conclude this episode, I have one more player that I will talk about. And his name is Nicolas Beaudin, who went 27th overall to the Chicago Blackhawks in his draft year. He's now in Czech Republic playing pro hockey over there. The NHL didn't work out for him. He was another one of those small defensemen that went in the first round in 2018. Just looking at the list here of defensemen under 6 foot that went in the first round that year, obviously Quinn Hughes was, he's a stud, obviously. So we're not going to talk about him, but Adam Boqvist not really doing a whole lot at the NHL level. So interesting that Chicago did pick 2 defensemen under 6 foot in the first round that year with Boqvist and Beaudin. But you look at our other defensemen that went in the first round. Ty Smith, not an NHLer at this point. Ryan Merkley is in somewhere in the KHL. Beaudin, Nils Lundqvist, a guy we really like. He's not doing a whole lot. Yeah, he's the one not doing a whole lot at the NHL level. Rasmus Sandin, not one of my favorite, but he's still like a decent NHL player, but nothing crazy here. So there was a lot of guys that they were supposed to be that new age defenseman that everyone was raving about. A lot of them just end up being not good enough for the NHL. So this was the case with Beaudin, who was a late birthday, had a good draft year, but if you look before that, he didn't really set the queue on fire. So that should have been maybe like a little red flag next to his name. If I'm looking back, so that was his 18 years old season. He had 69 points, played on a good Drummondville team that year. But before that, he was a fine defenseman, very smart, but not dynamic with his feet, not dynamic with his skill set. Didn't really project as a PP1 guy, and obviously the lack of size, defending, all that combined. In today's hockey, you have a defenseman with that profile, he's not even getting drafted. 6 years ago, they were getting drafted in the first round. Maybe a guy like him gets picked, late in the draft, but like if you look at last year's draft, some defensemen that look and played like him didn't get drafted. So it's very interesting how it completely changed since that's 2018. But I really think the NHL from 2020, a lot of NHL teams just like, if he's under 6 feet, he better be really, really good. And that was not the case for Beaudin. He was a decent prospect, but didn't really fit what the NHL is today. So again, that was a lesson learned, I think, from our staff, about like those smaller defensemen and how like those bigger defensemen are, playing a lot more come playoff time, or a lot more successful come playoff time, and it's really hard for those smaller defensemen to really achieve success come playoff time. If you want to, the goal is to win the Stanley Cup. It's 2 months of hell for those teams, for those players. It's a game every 2 nights. It's an all-out war on the ice. It's really like, you have to be really special to survive as a smaller defenseman come playoff time. Obviously, you look at Cale Makar. Well, Cale Makar is an insane hockey player, but an insane athlete. So you look at some of the defensemen from the 2018 class that didn't do well. That's skating was for some of them, the skating was not good enough. They were not good enough athlete, not good enough athletic ability is what I'm trying to say here. I think in Beaudin's case and all the other defensemen that I mentioned from that draft class, I think this was like the last draft where you saw a lot of them go high in the draft, and hockey is changing really quickly, and we saw that with like those smaller defensemen that were really popular from those 2013 to, I'd say, 2020, and then after that, everything has changed. So those guys they don't really have unless they're really, really, really good, they don't really have much of a chance to be drafted, really early in the draft, or draft at all. So I don't know if Brad, do you want to add something to that? But this is a bit of my 2 cents on Beaudin and the small defenseman from that era.
Sure. Tampa Bay is the reason it changed. And if you want to know, I'll give all of you a little secret. The 2 things you want to really hone in on to see if a small defenseman can really translate now is processing rate. So adaptive processing, preset processing. So adaptive meaning real time, how dynamically can they shift in broken play types and create options for themselves, create double, triple option scenarios for themselves out on the ice. And then preset processing. So how do they basically mentally map the ice in advance so they can find trailing backdoor options, weak side options. That's step 1. Step 2 is assertiveness. Cale Makar, Quinn Hughes, no adoption. What do they do that some of these other kids didn't? They assert themselves on the ice. Adam Boqvist does not assert himself. Ty Smith didn't assert himself. Nils Lundqvist doesn't assert himself. That's the secret sauce right there. It's processing, assertiveness. That's the base.
All right. Well, that will do it for this week episode. Thanks for being with us again today. Thank you for everyone who likes our video. Please share our video. Please share our YouTube channel. It's going to really help us grow the channel. If you really like what we do, we have some extra content on the website, so you can check our insiders membership. I will put a link on the below the video on the video description on YouTube, so you can quickly access that. And me and Brad will be back next week for another episode of Scouting Sessions. So we'll talk to you guys next week.